Hey guys, today we are going to talk about the presidency, and your second quiz has been posted, so you have a week to take that. Next week, this is our only lecture this week, and then next week we'll have two lectures on the bureaucracy and the American legal system and the courts, and then the following week we will have a lecture on public opinion and have your third quiz, and the week after that you'll have your second exam. Please always email me if you have any questions. When your second exam is posted, I will also post your essay prompt, and don't forget that is 20% of your grade. So are all of your exams. So please email me at my Gmail if you have any questions. But let's dig into the presidency. So your textbook starts out talking about when Trump won the presidency. You can see my dog back there. Sorry. He didn't have a lot of faith from the Republican establishment, which was different from when George W. Bush came into office. He had this strong mandate of voters that Trump did not have. Backwards. Trump did have a strong mandate of voters, but not of his unified party. He does have a unified Congress, though, when he comes into office, and didn't come in with an opposition party determined to thwart his agenda. That didn't come until halfway through his term. Midterm loss, like we talked about last class. But Trump does share with the majority party, the Republican majority, the eagerness to eliminate a lot of Obama's legacy, right? This is things like TPP, the Dodd-Frank repeal, Obamacare, tax cuts, the Supreme Court situation that we talked about last class. He wanted to use signing statements, executive actions, but there was this tension between Congress and the president, especially then. But our founders really intended on having this tension built. The president is not supposed to be the most powerful person on the planet. Do we think that maybe he wants to be? Sometimes, yes. When anything significant happens, we do look to the president to solve our problems and to represent the nation in our times of struggle, tragedy, and triumph. But the Constitution provides for a fairly weak executive. It's difficult for the president to be both the head of government and the head of state. We'll get to that. Most countries have those as two people. Plus, the need to get along with the other branches of government with whom they share the power makes this prestigious job difficult to do well. Should the president represent the interest of the people who voted for him or of all Americans? It's a tough question. So the president wasn't really a preoccupation with the framers of the Constitutional Convention. I mean, it was completely left out in the Articles of Confederation. They didn't provide for any form of a central executive. And so they were more concerned with the legislature having the real political power. But after the breakdown under the Articles, they showed there was a need for a strong central executive. So the founders provided for what's called an electoral college, a group of people who would be chosen by the states for the sole purpose of electing the president. They assumed they would be made of good citizens who would exercise care and good judgment casting their ballots and would not make post-election claims against him. They also wanted to avoid the concentration of power that can be abused by a strong executive, as they learned with King George III. Many of the arguments we hear for a stronger executive come from Hamilton's Federalist No. 70 for a more energetic president. So head of state versus head of government, the two roles that our president has to play. Head of state is the apolitical, unifying role of the president as a symbolic representative of the whole country. This is kind of what our founders had pictured. Sitting at the top of a small executive branch, commanding the armed forces and representing the nation. In most countries, this is apolitical, like in Great Britain, it's the Queen. The founders wanted the president to carry the dignity but not the power of a monarch. George Washington even wanted them to bear the title, His High Mightiness, the President of the United States and Protector of their Liberties. What if we'd used that? That would have been crazy. We weren't ready for such a pompous title, but we do place the president on a higher plane than other politicians. What political impact might have resulted if we'd used that title? The president has other things to do as head of state, like greeting other heads of state, attending state funerals, tossing out the first baseball of the season, hosting the annual Easter egg roll, which is really fun and a really fun perk when you do work for the White House, which we have gotten to go to. Console survivors of a national tragedy. The vice president can do some of these things, but sometimes only the president will do. He also serves as the role of head of government. This is the political role as the president of the leader, as a leader of the political party and chief arbiter of who gets what resources. So because we have a system of checks and balances, the president also has real political powers that are intended to keep the other branches in check. They run the government, make the law, and function as the head of the political party, which means some citizens win more than others, some lose, some get angry, all of which works against this unifying image of head of state. Countries like Great Britain have a second person in this role, like the Prime Minister, who's expected to be political and much more powerful than the President, though this has changed a lot since FDR's New Deal. The political requirements of the president's role as head of government necessarily undermine his unifying role as head of state, and hyperpartisanship of Congress makes it even harder to bridge those conflicting roles. The Constitution is very limited on what it says about the president. Article 2 is very short. The president is to be chosen by an electoral college to serve a 4-year term. The number of terms was unlimited until 1951, after FDR's fourth term spurred a constitutional amendment to limit to 2 terms. You must be a natural-born citizen of the United States, at least 35 years old and a resident for 14 years, succeeded by the vice president. There's no line of succession after the vice president, but there is a Presidential Succession Act, which came about in 1947, that does establish succession after the vice president. The 25th Amendment talks about when the vice president can take over when the president is unable to serve. The president can be removed from office for reasons of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, which requires an in-depth investigation. Of course, the House votes to impeach by a simple majority vote, which charges the president with a crime. Then the Senate tries the president on the articles of impeachment and convict by a 2/3 majority. Impeachment, of course, is the formal charge by the House that the president or another member of the executive branch has committed an act of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, which may or may not result in removal from office. Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump have been impeached but not convicted. The power of impeachment is meant to be a check on the president, but it's often threatened for partisan purposes. These resolutions have been filed against almost every president. Ronald Reagan over the invasion of Grenada and Iran-Contra affair, George H.W. Bush over Iran-Contra, George W. Bush for a lot of reasons, including falsifying evidence justifying war in Iraq. So on and so forth. Everybody has this when you have an opposing party in Congress. Nixon, of course, would have been impeached had he not resigned in 1974. The House Judiciary had passed the resolution. There were enough votes to pass the measure on the House floor and gain conviction in the Senate, but he did end up resigning before that all took place. Impeachment is more of a political process than a legal process. So it's very vague in the Constitution and can mean anything as long as the majority of the House and 2/3 of the Senate is willing to vote on it. Because the Constitution is so vague on presidential powers, it was able to be ratified by those who wanted a strong executive power and those who didn't. This vagueness has also allowed the powers of the president to expand over time without constitutional amendment. The presidential power falls into 3 areas: executive authority to administer government, and legislative power and judicial powers to check the other 2 branches. So executive, this is Article 2, Section 1. It shall be vested in a president. It doesn't say the executive power shall be vested in the president. It doesn't say what executive power it entails, and this has been debated throughout all of the American history. Section 3 says that president shall take care that laws be faithfully executed, which is much of the executive authority. President is the chief administrator of the nation's laws. Chief administrator is his executive role as the head of a federal agency, the person responsible for implementation of national policies. The president, with approval of the majority of the Senate, can appoint the heads of departments who will oversee the work of implementation. This is known as the cabinet. The cabinet is a presidential advisory group selected by the president, made up of the vice president and the heads of federal executive departments and other high officials to whom the president elects to give cabinet status. He appoints more than 3,500 federal employees, cabinet and lower administrative offices, judges, military officers, diplomatic corps. The president is the head of a really vast federal bureaucracy. But his power is limited. He appoints them, but he can't fire many of them, which we'll talk about next week. He serves as commander-in-chief, which is his role as the top officer of the country's military establishment. Congress has the power to declare war, but as commander-in-chief, the president has the practical ability to wage war. These powers are meant to check each other, but they usually provide for a battleground on the power of military operations. Chief foreign policy maker, the president's executive role as a primary shaper of relations with other nations. This is not spelled out in the Constitution, but the foundation is laid in the provision that the president, negotiates treaties, which are formal agreements with other countries negotiated by the president and requiring 2/3 approval of the Senate. But a lot of foreign policy is made through what's called an executive agreement, which are agreements with other countries that create foreign policy without the need for senatorial approval. They're used a lot more frequently than treaties. So he has legislative powers as well. He's the head of the executive branch, and he has some powers to check Congress, to tell from time to time information of the State of the Union and recommend their consideration as he shall judge necessary and expedient. The State of the Union address. This is a speech that that the president is to give annually to a joint session of Congress and to the nation, announcing his agenda. He has the power to convene Congress, and when there's a dispute about when to disband, he can adjourn it as well. But Congress meets regularly now, and that's not really invoked anymore. He also has the power of a presidential veto, which is his authority to reject a bill passed by Congress that can only be overridden by a 2/3 majority in each house, which is a really difficult thing to do. So even the threat of a presidential veto is really powerful. The president doesn't have constitutional power to make laws, but this power has grown. He can make what's called an executive order, which is a clarification of congressional policy issued by the president and that has the full force of law. He can issue these to clarify how laws passed by Congress are to be implemented, and he tends to release these at a higher rate at the beginning of his presidency than at the end. They are not congressionally made laws, so any new president can reverse any predecessor's executive orders. And then there's something called a signing statement, which is a statement recorded along with signed legislation that clarifies the president's understanding of the constitutionality of that legislation. This is quasi-legislative. It can significantly increase the president's role as policymaker. The president has a tremendous long-term impact on the judiciary, though. In the short term, his powers are meager, but he has a continuing impact from nominating judges to the federal courts, including the Supreme Court. There are political philosophies of individual judges that significantly influence how they interpret the law, especially for the Supreme Court, who is the final arbiter of constitutional meaning. Since judges serve for life, presidential appointments have a long-lasting effect. Conservative courts, we still mostly have a conservative court thanks to Reagan and Bush in the 80s and 90s. Eisenhower appointed Chief Justice Earl Warren and Justice William Brennan, and they turned out to be way more liberal than he anticipated, though. When Eisenhower was asked if he had any regrets as president, he said yes, 2, and they're sitting on the Supreme Court. So the Senate must confirm these appointments. They're usually approved with occasional exceptions. We talked last class about one. And the Senate filibuster threat causes nominations to be held up and create a backlog of cases. So both parties can try to play the game to prevent undesired ideological shifts in the federal courts. You can have something called senatorial courtesy, which you grant to senior citizens of the president's party, a lot of power over federal judges' appointments in their home states. Another way in the short run, the president can't do much on the judiciary. He can nominate these judges who sit and have a lifetime term, but he can't contact judges to plead for decisions, and his criticism of them is usually poorly received. But a less controversial way to influence the judiciary is having the Department of Justice invest resources in arguing a case. The Solicitor General is the Justice Department officer who argues the government's cases before the Supreme Court. He is the only bridge between the executive and the judiciary, not only deciding which cases the government will appeal to the Supreme Court, but also filing petitions stating that the government's, usually the president's, position on cases, which the government isn't even a party. Of course, another judicial power granted to the president is the pardoning power, which is his authority to release or excuse a person from the legal penalties of a crime. When the pardons are motivated, this comes from the traditional power of the king as the court of last resort and as a check on the courts. But when they're motivated by more political or personal or partisan considerations rather than as a check on the power of the courts, they're often seen as a potential abuse of the public trust. What about the evolution of the American presidency? It's obviously evolved a lot since our country has grown. The presidency outlined in the Constitution is not the presidency of today. We have kind of pre-1930s and post-1930s. Traditional presidency is the founder's version of limited executive power, which survived for over 100 years, and then we came to FDR. So inherent powers are presidential powers that are implied but not stated explicitly in the Constitution. They had the duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, which some like Lincoln meant national security meant a broader presidential role. These powers are not listed in the Constitution but are implied by the powers that are granted and supported mostly by the Supreme Court. And then we have the modern presidency. This is a trend toward a higher degree of executive power since the 1930s, which is still a work in progress. The simple rural nature of life in the United States changed rapidly in the 150 years after our founding. Our country grew westward and more industrialized. FDR's New Deal, though, meant the size of government exploded, and popular ideas about our government changed radically. The use of strong presidential power became an expectation of the modern president. Nobody was prepared for the Great Depression. The economy went into a tailspin. Unemployment soared. Herbert Hoover, who was president at the time, said government only has limited powers here and limited responsibility to deal with what he believed was a private economic crisis. There was no widespread presumption, as there is now, that the government was responsible for the state of the economy for alleviating the economic suffering of its citizens. FDR had served 4 terms and initiated an entirely new level of government activism. Government was, for the first time, assuming responsibility for the economic well-being of its citizens on a substantial scale. FDR said he was waging war on the Depression and he sought from Congress the powers that would be given to him if he were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. He put into place programs that greatly increased the size of the federal establishment and his budget. There were a number of civilians working for the federal government that increased by 50% in his first 2 terms. I wonder how presidential behavior might change if presidents were allowed to serve more than 2 terms now. I don't know who could have gotten elected more than 2 terms, honestly, though. The legacy of the New Deal is now that Americans look to the president and their government to regulate the economy, to solve their social problems, and to provide political inspiration. No president has had such a profound impact on how Americans live their lives today than FDR. Some presidents like Carter and Reagan and Clinton promised to cut back the size of government, but few efforts were successful. The imperial presidency, there's a philosophy behind it summed up by Nixon years after his resignation as when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. There is a battle over whether or not the powers of the modern presidency have reached imperial status, with things like Watergate and Vietnam making it harder for the modern presidents to act. Congress, the media, the courts, they're checking the president in ways they hadn't done in the past. The media is now subjecting the president to closer scrutiny and become more aggressive in their White House coverage. George W. Bush and Dick Cheney were determined to restore the luster and power of the office following post-Watergate. Many of their early executive orders were designed to bolster the presidential powers, as were their claims of executive privilege made by his administration. After 9/11, they had this strong and persuasive rationale for their desire to create a more muscular presidency. They had really high approval ratings after 9/11, so Congress didn't take on George W. Bush. But after his early election in 2004 and waning approval ratings, he was seen as vulnerable enough to be criticized. And then Obama, unlike the Bush-Cheney attempts to bulk up the executive, he struggled with wanting to be a muscular president like that. He wanted to support traditional checks and balances, but he rejected the George W. Bush aspirations of the more muscular presidency. He turned more to the executive order to get his agenda passed. Presidential politics. So the Constitution has not been altered to give the president more power, which has resulted in an expectations gap that makes the job inherently challenging. This is the gap between popular expectation of what a modern president can and should do, and the constitutional powers to actually get things done. So to avoid failure, the president has to seek power beyond that of which is explicitly granted in the Constitution, and even beyond what they can claim as part of their inherent powers. The president deals with an expectation gap by attempting to augment their power with executive orders, executive agreements, claims of executive privilege, signing statements, etc. He can act some unilaterally, but to be successful, he has to develop his agenda with the power to persuade, which is his ability to convince Congress, other political actors, and the public to cooperate with the administration's agenda. This requires him to what's called going public, his presidential strategy of appealing to the public on an issue, expecting that public pressure will be brought to bear on other political actors. For example, the State of the Union, a town meeting style debate on a constitutional issue, a White House conference. This is going public. Only a popular president, though, can use this strategy of going public effectively. So popularity ratings have been crucial to how successful a president can be. Since the 1930s, Gallup has been asking people if they approved of the president. This number varies from president to president, but also varies widely within a single term. Ratings are a political barometer. The higher they are, the more effective the president is with other political and economic actors. The lower they are, the harder the president finds it to get people to go along. There are 3 factors that can affect political or presidential popularity: the cycle effect, the economy, and unifying or divisive current events. The cycle effect, of course, is the predictable rise and fall of a president's popularity at different stages in office. Of course, most enter the office with a relatively high rating, which declines as they move through their 4 years. Early on, it's called the honeymoon period, the time following an election when a president's popularity is high and congressional relations are likely to be productive. The state of the economy. Since FDR, the government has taken this active role in regulating the national economy, and every president since then has promised economic prosperity. And then newsworthy events can also influence presidential approval. They're judged by their response to events, but even those beyond their control. Like, for example, the BP Gulf oil spill in 2010, Obama's ratings took a hit as the oil continued to spill, even though there was little he could do. But unifying events can help presidential ratings. 9/11 helped George W. Bush push through legislation that was already on his agenda, but now he had public support. The president and Congress usually defines the nation's problems and possible solutions in different ways. They have different constituencies to please, like we talked about last class. The president has more and needs to take a wider view. Congress has narrow constituencies and can represent particular interests. They don't always line up to wanting the same things. There is someone who works for the president called a legislative liaison who works with members of Congress to secure their support in getting the president's legislation passed. But right now, sometimes, we are likely to end up with what's called a divided government later this fall, if we do see a midterm loss, like I talked about. This is the situation that exists when political rule is split between 2 parties, one controlling the White House and the other controlling one or both houses of Congress. Right now, we have a unified government. We have a Democrat president and House and Senate. But if we do experience the midterm loss and Republicans take over, that will be what's called a divided government. It makes it a lot more successful for a president to be successful. There are members of different parties that stand for different approaches and solutions to the nation's problems. Under a divided government, Congress tends to ignore what a president wants, and the president tends to veto what the opposition party in Congress wants. So nobody's really successful in getting their agendas met. We tend to think of the president as one person, the single executive image, but the president is limited in what he accomplishes alone. He's over the presidency, which is the head of the executive branch. George Washington had no staff and a small cabinet of just 3 department heads, but now there's a cabinet composed of 15 departments, the executive office of the president, and the White House staff, which requires a vast bureaucracy. Each department is headed by a presidential appointee, which collectively forms the president's cabinet. 15 agencies heads. The executive office of the president is the collection of 9 organizations that help the president with policy and political objectives. The Office of Management and Budget is the organization within the EOP that oversees the budgets of departments and agencies. They write the president's budget to reflect his own policy agenda. There's the Council of Economic Advisors, which is the organization within the EOP that advises the president on economic matters. And then the National Security Council, the organization within the EOP that provides foreign policy advice to the president, giving the president daily updates about events around the world. The White House staff. It has the White House office, which has more than 400 employees within the EOP who work most closely and directly with the president. They actually have offices in the White House, not the Eisenhower Executive Office building across the street. And their appointments don't have to be confirmed by the Senate. FDR had about 40. In 2013, there were about 460. But yeah. They have 3 functions: policymaking and coordination, outreach and communications, and internal coordination. The chief of staff is the person who oversees the operation of all White House staff and controls access to the president. For most of history, the vice president hasn't been an important actor in presidential administrations. Originally, the vice president was offered to the second place presidential candidate, so they were seen as a potential rival and excluded from most decisions. This was corrected by the 12th Amendment in 1804, which provided for electors to select both the president and vice president together. The Constitution only provides that the vice president is the tie-breaking vote in the Senate, so it's not typically an enviable post, though it's what the vice president makes of it. The vice president typically balances out the president geographically, experience-wise, policy-wise. A lot of vice presidents find it a good launching pad for a presidential bid. Of course, Joe Biden served as Obama's vice president. The first spouse, the office of the first lady is in tremendous flux, even the term. We could maybe have a first gentleman. There's no way to check the influence of the first spouse. It's often seen as a national commentary on how women in general should behave. Rosalind Carter attended Jimmy Carter's cabinet meetings. And Hillary Clinton, of course, was a major part of Bill Clinton's time as governor. And then when she was selected senator after his presidency ended. She ran for president. She became Obama's Secretary of State. She's run for president again. Lady Bird Johnson was known for supporting highway beautification. Nancy Reagan was known as saying, just say no for drugs. Laura Bush was known as focusing on education, youth, and literacy. And Michelle Obama was known for her work in health and nutrition. Most presidents you've got to have a giant ambition and a large ego. They're classified on two levels: their energy level, are they passive or active, and their orientation toward life, are they positive or negative. Sometimes the best and most popular presidents are usually active positives: FDR, JFK, Clinton, Obama. Some passive positives are Reagan, George W. Bush. An active negative would be Richard Nixon. And then the presidential style. This is the image projected by the president that represents how he or she would like to be known at home and abroad. Truman was known as being a straight, profane, no-nonsense decision maker. Eisenhower was known as the victorious general, a statesman above the fray of petty day-to-day politics. JFK evoked a theme of getting the country moving again and embodied this with youth and energy. Reagan had a grandfatherly, optimistic presence. Clinton was known as feeling America's pain. George W. Bush was perceived as a non-intellectual who joked that C students could grow up to be president. He was interested in results, not academic debates, and was known as being more moral than Bill Clinton. Obama was even-keeled and introverted. No drama Obama. Though we may never meet our president, we can know him more intimately now through television. One thing to ponder after this lecture today is, how do we think presidential behavior would change? I brought this up before. If we allowed presidents to serve more than 2 terms, and do we think that we have anybody who could have served more than 2 terms? Just something to ponder. I will be back next week. Be sure and take your second quiz. I'll be back next week with a lecture on bureaucracy and the American legal systems and the courts. Please email me at my Gmail with any questions. Thanks.